Thank you very much for the invite to speak. Yes, so my name is Reema. I work for an organisation called the Ada Lovelace Institute. It's a relatively new organisation, research and deliberative body that aims to ensure that data and AI work for people in society. And so we're a non-profit. We're co-funded by an organisation called the Nuffield Foundation. We're based in the UK, and really we were established around the aims, which was the importance of understanding the societal impacts of data and AI. And I'm going to be talking about a research program that I lead at the Ada Lovelace Institute called Rethinking Data. And as part of that, I think it's important to flag that it isn't just the data itself that we're rethinking, but also the ecosystem around the data. So we think about this in terms of a complex system. So lots of emergent adaptive properties in the system, different types of data that we're thinking about, data itself not being a tangible thing. How do we find a way of governing data in a way that works for people in society? I'm just going to share some slides now. The way we think about the system therefore is, given it's complex, adaptive, always changing, we might start with the analysis of the problem. And so in a way, there's a challenge that we have around data. So people like Shoshana Zuboff have argued that through surveillance capitalism that data is often exploited or commodified rather than treated as a public good. So often you have this real tension, which is that it is treated in using an enclosure-based model. So effectively gathered and bounded rather than accessible and available in a way that allows it to have benefits. And that raises some challenging questions, particularly when it comes to sensitive data, such as health data. This tension between protecting rights and responsibilities and obligations, but also enabling it to have its true social value, which is rarely articulated or enabled. So that's not entirely straightforward. Another point in terms of the analysis of the problem is the extent to which policymakers, politicians and administrative institutions have been playing catch up. So struggling to govern data in a holistic way that acknowledges it's actually really central to this question of what business models look like, or really central to the question of rights and agency and power, which lends me quite nicely on to the next point, which is about often a real sense of disempowerment on behalf of individuals, yes, but also groups and people in society around understanding or knowing how data that relates to them is used, and the challenges around the stark power imbalances or asymmetries that exist between people and corporation. I say people and corporations here, but actually that's a broader set of organisations and individuals that are often accessing and being able to use data. And I think there's a really interesting point, which is in terms of thinking about data itself, there's a challenge in how we understand it. So not as a object or a thing that is abstracted from people, but also of and relating to people, but also this feature about it, which is that the types of data that's often gathered or used and deployed is rarely ever entirely neutral. So they're often being very political choices and socioeconomic choices about what it is that one chooses to use or gather and deploy, and then also political choices about how that is used as well. So so just thinking really carefully, why is it that we choose to gather certain types of information about certain people, but also about our economy or our society, as opposed to other types of information, and often those come down to political choices and choices that we have decided that a certain type of information is important or relevant, and other types of information are less important or less relevant. So through this program, we have a vision which we've set out. One is around understanding better what the social value of data is. So what is it about data that enables it to deliver public good or public benefits, and clearly defining that. Another is around recognising that there are these asymmetries of power, these political decisions that are being made, and recognising that there are instances in which people may be subject to what we describe as data injustices, so misuses or abuses of power and misuses of data, so preventing against the risk of that. There's this kind of notion which seems to be nascent at the moment. A lot of people talk about data stewardship, so thinking about data as something that is commonly governed or akin to something like air or water, and engendering a set of relationships and responsibilities between us and wider society, and also on the part of actors, whether it's regulators or industry or public bodies, promoting the idea or the notion that there are a set of responsibilities that power holders have towards people in society through the notion of data stewardship. And I guess there's a kind of fourth point around purpose-driven innovation. So often we talk about data-driven innovation or benefits from data and AI. And there's something important about what outcomes that innovation is achieving. Will it achieve benefits for everyone, all groups in society, or will it simply entrench inequalities there? So what's the mission here? And here I'm quite influenced by the work that people like Mariana Ramatacato have done on the entrepreneurial state. So the idea that innovation can have societal benefits and societal outcomes, but we need to think quite critically about how that works or is operating, what responsible innovation in the space looks like. And we can't just assume that innovation for its own sake will just deliver those benefits. So I'll be really interested to hear your thoughts on that. And fifthly, kind of speaking to this point about rights and regulations. So if data stewardship is one way of seeing the governance or thinking about the governance of data, then what specific rights does that engender? And a lot of people talk about GDPR and data protection, but maybe there are other rights around the prevention of harms or other rights that relate to collective agencies. So, in the US, for instance, class action is a really big feature of being able to initiate a conversation about expectations around data governance. Regulation, this is a really interesting thing. A lot of people have advocated for different types of regulation. I think the key question is what should the governance or the regulation seek to achieve? But none of these are especially simple things, as I feel like I've already made clear. So I'm really keen to have a discussion with you about your thoughts on this. And because of the kind of nature of the challenge, what we've done is sort of identify 3 levers or 3 components to our vision. And we start with narrative. So I've already kind of engaged in the active narrative. I've spoken about data stewardship. I've spoken about power asymmetries and injustices. And there's really interesting points about the types of language and narrative that we use when we talk about data. So often those conversations, that language can make people feel more disconnected and distant from the issues that arise. I think related to that, there's this kind of question about practices. So, and as part of this, we're really interested in a range of case studies that seek to balance the rights and the protection that people have in relation to their sensitive data, whilst at the same time enabling it to be used for public benefit. So in the health data space, often biobank type models have really interesting governance processes that allow people to have greater levels of access, control and participation over their data, but also there are layers of access for industry organisations and for public bodies to be able to use that data for research purposes. So there's a lot of really interesting experimentation that's happening in this space, and getting a good picture of what that looks like is something that's a real interest to us, and we're doing a research project specifically on that in terms of reviewing these case studies and analysing them from what good and what more challenging looks like and where the gaps are. And then of course we have an international working group that is advising us on this question about regulation. So this is quite EU focused, European Union focused, so starting with the building blocks of the GDPR, but also thinking about in 10-15 years, what do we want a data governance ecosystem that reflects some of these values to look like. I mean, I think there's some key issues around data governance that seem to be emerging, which is the sort of low visibility of not so much use, but also just low visibility in terms of a public domain about what's actually happening and the effect it's having on different groups of people. The sort of challenge, which is around lack of a common vision or common or shared language. So I spoke a bit about narrative, but it's really interesting how narratives seem to vary quite a lot about what data is or can or should be. People will be familiar with the frame, data is the new oil, and the sort of critiques that have been levelled around that. But what's really interesting is that the critiques don't come from very different standpoints. So you have the sort of data as labour argument that people like Shoshana Zuboff articulate, and other people talking more with the frames or the language that come from the environmental movement of stewardship and so on. And it feels like people feel like there are issues, but really struggling to forge or build a shared language. I mean, lack of public engagement seems to be interesting. I mean, I would say that I am the organisation's head of public engagement, but it speaks to the challenge of connecting people in society with the conversation about data and AI. And then power asymmetries here. So, you know, a lot of the skills and the expertise are in the private sector, and that's not necessarily a problem, but it does raise challenges for power asymmetries between public bodies, particularly those that want to make good and effective use of data, and private sector organisations, and indeed power asymmetries between public bodies and the people to whom the data relates. So, you know, there's a real disparity of experience and lack of common guidance on ethics and technical standards. More broadly, one of the reasons we developed this programme is the sort of question of how we take a systems lens and a systematic approach to managing risk. Although there have been some really interesting areas of work in this space in Germany, so through the German Data Ethics Commission, which I think is the only data ethics commission that I've come across so far, looking at this question of what systems change in this area looks like. I've actually taken this from the German Data Ethics Commission report in terms of like what the this is the diagram that I haven't had nothing to do with, but it sort of articulates how we might think about risk and harm generated by data-driven application and ways of being quite granular. I think it's quite. I think it invites more question in response to it than anything else. I'm not sure it's the final word, but it's a really interesting example of you know, how we might move beyond the conversation just about data protection to thinking about the ramifications of how data is used and governing that. I think that's pretty much it for me, but you can find out more on our website, and I've also written a paper which I'm more than happy to share. And I'm going to stop sharing and sort of open it up for questions, comments and thoughts.
Yeah, I think there's quite a few questions. I think maybe let's start tackling each of them. So let's start with one question from Maria in the Q&A. So it says,
Yeah.
thanks, Reema. There seems to be an assumption that individuals should have agency over their data, but also the view that data should be treated as a public good. Data stewardship also assumes somehow that individuals can delegate some form of rights to a third party, which implies this notion of their data. How to reconcile this, and what are your general thoughts on this concept of delegating one's
Yeah.
ownership to a third party? And yeah, that's a really good question. What's your thoughts on that? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting, this, and I think it kind of comes from a challenge, which is what data is. And without kind of going into a rabbit hole, a lot of people have seemed to suggest. So, I mean, essentially, I think that it's really, this tension comes from the fact that there is no obvious analogy for data, but there are different features or analogies that work when we think about different components of data that helps. So one conventional way of thinking about this has been through the lens of property rights, and we find that's quite challenging or problematic because there are features of data that aren't like property, not least the sort of relationship between data and people in society. Another way of thinking about this is through the lens of data stewardship, but as you rightly argued, even, data isn't like water or air, in the sense that it's not easy to separate data from the people who engender or in some way create it, but it's not individualistic. So even the challenge around data rights and data protection is that it's really hard to even reach for the analogy of the way we conventionally thought about rights, which is that rights relate to individuals. And I guess the challenge back is whether we need to reconcile these different frames, or whether we just need to recognize that what we're doing is we're using imperfect analogies that are drawn from other ways of seeing the world that help us develop a new way of seeing the world, to articulate data, which is quite fundamentally different to all these other concepts. So I would almost sort of like push back and say, maybe it's helpful to have a kind of pluralism here in terms of the language that we use, and maybe that will help us navigate some of these tensions. But I'd be really interested to hear Maria's thoughts on that.
Okay, so I think we'll dive further. There's a couple of other questions to follow up on. There is another question from Shaylee, which says, how do we educate the public about the social value of their data? What kind of assurances will they need?
Yeah, no, this is really interesting, because we do a lot of deliberative public engagement at the Ada Lovelace Institute. So we ran a project working with Wellcome Trust, understanding patient data, that ran citizen juries on this very thorny issue, which is what the Foundations of Fairness look like for health data partnerships between the NHS, the National Health Service in the UK, and public bodies. And it's kind of interesting, because one of the things that really struck me through this process was that people do understand that the value of, I'm really sorry, there's a police car driving.
Oh, we can't hear it.
People do understand that the data, that data, patient data, for example, is incredibly valuable, but that doesn't mean, and they actually, our experience with the deliberative processes that we've had is that they do support the use of that data in ways that deliver public benefit, but they want a clear sense of what the boundaries are to public benefits and public interest. And then the other thing is that just because they support the effective use of their data for social or value or public benefit, that doesn't mean that they have no concerns about how it's going to be used. So there's a really interesting, often we sort of position this as either you think that data has social value, it should be opened up or used in a broader way, or there's a kind of you're concerned about data rights and data ethics, and typically we found that people are really supportive about enabling and harnessing social value of data, and they also want to ensure that there are safeguards. And also what we typically have found through these processes is that people recognise that the importance of the safeguards to realising the social value. The types of things that we've heard about come from a really kind of fundamental level, which is around how do we ensure that data is secure, that the bare minimum necessary being used for particular outcomes, that there are safeguards in terms of protecting against the monetization of data. That people get really passionate about this question about monetization of data. Data being used in a way that will ultimately be commodified, is it actually being used for social value? So real reassurances around that. A lot up in these sorts of discussions about how we understand the impacts and kind of communicate that. So often still it's very much taken for granted that data will have just the argument that data will have public benefit is sufficient, but actually there's a lot of emphasis on, well, okay, so in what way has this happened and what's been the effect of that? So being able to measure and capture and communicate that. And we're still very much at the beginning of the conversation. And I guess there's also really, in some of the workshops we've had more recently, people have asked questions like, how do I know that the data is good enough for the purposes to which it's being deployed and intended to be deployed? So something could be gathered or be good enough for one particular purpose, but that doesn't mean that it can just be reused or redeployed in a different context entirely. We may have different standards around that type of data. So that's a really complex question.
Yeah, no, that's really good. And here's a follow-up into that, because I think that's a very important topic. So the follow-up, it's on the chat. It basically says, it would be interesting to understand what is the interconnection between individual level awareness versus top-down regulatory / standardization approach. And also, it would be good to understand your perspective of how the UK sits in contrast with other countries in regards to, i.e., is UK more mature or less mature in this context?
Yeah.
What are your thoughts?
Yeah. Sorry, just give me 1 second. I can't hear you very well, I'm afraid.
Let me try.
Could you just
maybe let me try moving closer.
Is that better? Hello?
Is that better?
Hi.
Can you hear me now?
Right. Try again. Sorry.
Okay. No. But can you hear me now? And then I'll repeat the question.
I think I can hear you now.
Oh, perfect. Okay. So basically, the follow-up question. And let me know, and I'll repeat it. I don't know. Ryan, can you hear me, or is it?
Yeah, I can hear you quite clearly. Reema, can you hear me well?
Yes, Ryan, I can hear you. I can't hear it. Yeah. Okay. Good.
That's very strange. Okay.
It's really strange. Really strange. Let's try it once again. If not, maybe Ryan, you can repeat the question, because I think maybe my audio is not that good.
You're a little bit quiet.
What about now?
Oh yeah, you're much louder now. Yeah.
Okay, I'm just actually speaking closer to the computer. Okay, so fair enough. Let's try that. Okay, so just to repeat the question, basically the question is, what is the relationship between personal individual awareness versus top-down regulatory or standard-based approach, and where does the UK sit compared to other nations in regards to maturity in this respect?
Yeah, I so again, back through the systems lens, I'm not sure that they're mutually exclusive in the sense that and to some extent I think there's a relationship between them, which is the ability to effect change in relation to your own data seems to rely very much on being able to have mechanisms through which one does that. So, you know, and that requires creating a series of mechanisms, and that may be about regulation, but it also may just be about designing approaches through which people can articulate or express what they would like to happen with their data or to do with their data, which kind of comes back to this point about not just regulation, but also practices and finding a way that's upstream of regulation. But what's really interesting with regards to regulation is twofold. One is it does shape what is possible or what is not possible in a particular environment. So it has a really important role in that respect, and it does signal what is ideal or what is not ideal in a particular environment. Got some really interesting, really interesting aspects as a result of that. I'm really kind of interested in some of the work that Julie Cohen has written on what she kind of described in a rather academic way as the legal constructions of informational capitalism, which is it's a book, relatively recent book on Beyond the Truth and Power. But essentially her argument is that even when we think we don't have regulation, we actually do have regulation. So, you know, an example that she gives is that if you want to build a factory, for instance, you may need to acquire some land and then, you know, purchase some land and remove some people who may be inhabiting the land from the land. And it may not look like that's a highly regulated environment, but you do need a set of norms around property rights and property governance there. And it's a really interesting lens to think about, because even though we think, for instance, that there's not much data governance, there may be rights and regulations that already exist that we're just simply not aware of or haven't really thought about in terms of using or developing in relation to data. Also there's just this wider set of conversations, which is, you know, is that default good enough, or do we need to build on that default? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. No, that's great. That's great. So we have another question from Magda. So Magda is asking, what solution do you see to the lack of a unified framework for responsible AI in the UK? And who do you see as the organizations who should take a lead on this?
It's a good question. So I guess that one of the big challenges here is responsible AI is a really, really tough one, because it covers a lot of different users and applications of technologies. And in terms of the organizations that take a lead or could take a lead, I think that one of the big challenges is whether we might want to ask whether it needs a unified framework, or whether what we really need is for all organized, so again, this point about the holistic approach to the governance of responsible AI data, whatever frame you use to think about it. It feels like instead of sort of pointing to one or two or even a cluster of organizations that needs to take a lead, it's a system point, which is that we all need to recognize the importance of AI in terms of, my local authority, for instance. I'd really hope that they're thinking about this. I really expect them to be thinking about this and the impact that that's having upon people, because and that's a highly localized organization. If you're, I don't know, a charity that campaigns for the rights of migrants, you certainly will probably want to be thinking about this. So there is this really interesting question, which is, is it about creating a unified framework, or is it about getting into a conversation where everyone feels confident to be able to participate in and influence responsible AI, influence or shape responsible use of the data?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. No, that's really, really interesting. And there's another question here, which basically says, thank you for this. I'm interested to know what Reema makes of the Open Data Institute and Microsoft partnership, do you think is a positive sign of more data collaborations for the public good in the future? And I guess as a follow-up, yeah, what is sort of like your thoughts in big tech, if we can call it like that, in big tech, leading those conversations around data best practices and regulation? Yeah, what's your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to comment specifically on individual partnerships between organisations because, firstly, I don't think that's my role. Either as the Ada Lovelace, as a spokesperson on behalf of the Ada Lovelace Institute or my own individual role. I guess what I could do is I can certainly point to the research that we've done on partnerships. I think that what was really interesting through the citizen juries that we convened is that people didn't have an intrinsic opposition to the partnerships, but they flagged certain risks. So, the risk of exploitation that may arise as a result of power asymmetry, that felt like that was quite important. And so they wanted clear safeguards in relation to that. I'm afraid I don't actually know enough about the Open Data Institute and Microsoft partnership to comment specifically on that. But that in general, it feels that partnerships and collaborations are important, but there's just some ethical questions that they raise in this kind of broader context around data governance. And the big challenge is, of course, is that people have different expectations of different types of organisations. So that is going to be really hard to navigate when you create collaborations between different types of organisations. And it's been particularly tough when you think about the relationship between, say, the National Health Service and Palantir, or we think about the, a local authority, I don't know, Microsoft, that kind of thing.
No, that's really good insight. Really interesting. So last week we basically had a session focused primarily on contact tracing applications and the ethics of COVID solutions. So it would be good to get your perspective of how the framework that you've presented and the work that you share, how do you see it fitting in context of such situations that require that type of, more speedy requirements and fast response, and specifically in the context of COVID? What's your thoughts on that?
Could you just repeat the question?
I can repeat.
Sorry.
I can repeat. No worries. So what are your thoughts in regards to the framework that you presented in your slides? In the context of situations like what we've seen with COVID, where there is an inherent adversarial relationship between data access and solutions. What's your thoughts?
Yeah, no, it's a really great question. So I think that one of the big challenges here is the extent to which COVID-19 seems to be really presenting some potentially long-term challenges to the way we think about certain values. So I mean, privacy is a really interesting example. So at the moment, the trade-off seems increasingly more stark between levels of privacy and one's ability to have freedom, for instance, the ability to sort of leave one's own home, and the kind of entire conversation about contact tracing seems to be at the heart of a broader question. So which the sort of debate about technology only reflects is this sort of tension between how much one needs to give up for one's own data in order to access one agency and freedom. And that's I think in a way the conversation about the technology isn't so much a conversation about the technology, but also a conversation about the way choices are presented, and how governments present those choices, so often through the technology, but more broadly. And then also there's a really interesting question, which is about how we how this entire experience is conditioning the norms and the values that we hold dear long term. So is there a risk, for instance, that we agree in quite exceptional times to compromise our privacy more than we otherwise would, but then that just turned into the new normal. So I'm hearing a lot around that challenge. And so for us, one of the things that we're really thinking about is this understanding this relationship. So can we understand the relationship between what we're experiencing at the moment and fundamental data norms? You know, privacy is one of them, but also the kind of, you know, how we see our liberties is another one. This kind of question of public interest or public good is a really, really tough one, tough nut to crack, because a lot of people at the moment are incredibly worried that the frame of public interest or public good is being used to undermine democratic norms and freedom. Essentially, I think there's a lot for us to think about, and we are thinking about it. It's not that straightforward. We're doing a fair bit of public engagement actually on this, using sort of rapid online deliberations in order to understand some of this stuff. I mean, in terms of the sort of the technologies themselves, symptom tracking, contact tracing, and potentially also immunity certification, depending on where governments go. We've written a report called "Exit Through the App Store?" Question mark at the end, which really illustrates the risks of solutionism around this. So the potential challenge around thinking that the technology is going to help us solve what are really quite difficult public health and difficult social and political choices that we're making.
Mm-hmm. No, it was really, really interesting. I'll pass it over to Ryan so that he follows on the next questions. I'll pass it over to Ryan. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. So next question is from Arcana. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right. Apologies if I'm not. They ask, do you have any advice on how to approach existing GDPR and data regulations that don't cater for new technological competencies, i.e. cloud, privacy preserving models, etc.?
Yes. So how to approach, I mean, it's interesting because I think that one of the big challenges is that GDPR is a useful building block, but it has struggled a little bit with the you know, essentially we've got here at the heart of the GDPR distinction between personal and non-personal data, data processing regulations around personal data, but also there are users of data that are not necessarily personal at all, that can have significant harms or affect particular groups, issues around bias, issues around inequality. I think there's two things. One is that the GDPR is a relatively new piece of regulation. And so there are arguments that it hasn't reached its full potential. And so there's some really interesting reports that have suggested that there's just greater need for resourcing and awareness and understanding of the GDPR across member states. And that's not so much advice as it is just a point which is it's new and perhaps hasn't been used to its full potential. And then there's this point, a wider point, which is about the rate of change. So things have changed so dramatically, even in this sort of 2 years since the GDPR has been introduced, in terms of some of the big changes, the way people think about data governing, and also the kind of rapid deployment of big data technology. But it does feel like some of those things that you pointed out, cloud, privacy preserving models, but also this question about the distinction between personal and non-personal data all under stress.
Yeah, it's interesting how when GDPR was first launched, there was some criticism that the EU was acting too early, that the space wasn't well enough developed, and yet now it feels like it's behind the times.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting because the GDPR comes in for a lot of flack, but of course, regulations you know, rely on other conditions for their success. They rely on people enforcing them, for instance, or people reading, especially at EU level, if you've got fragmentation of the way the framework's being applied, or people read it differently, then that raises challenges. And that's not really about regulation. That's about how you kind of get some consistency and harmonisation there.
Hmm. Well, I guess the next question is actually from me. So I find the institute's emphasis on like actually that's jumping ahead. I was actually asking to what extent these problems in this space are new. Evidently they are new, and the emphasis tends to be on the new. But there's also ways in which the problems are not entirely new. So many issues related to digital data use kind of resemble some pre-digital problems, like the use of photographs taken of individuals, either in public or private spaces. Actually, somebody else has asked a question about that, and like issues about the use of postal records. So, like I don't expect the post office to like tell other companies who I'm getting mail from. Or for anyone to tamper with my mail, but those kinds of questions don't get the same sort of drama, I guess. Yeah, so I guess I'm wondering, like, maybe to what extent perhaps the what's new is more about the variety of data and the uses and the pace of change. So I guess that sounds like, I'm not sure where the question is there. Do you agree, guys?
No, it's again really great question. I agree that the problems themselves are not new. I guess like what seems to be new is that the way we might draw upon old, you know, I mean, it's quite rare that you have new problems. I actually think that often the problems are themselves are not new. It's just that the context in which they arise has changed, or the weight or the level of importance becomes intensified. So, if, you know, data's always been around. There's never been a world in which we've not had data.
Yeah.
And for as long as people and society exist, there will be data. But what's changed? Well, it's been the intensification of its use, the sort of, you know, the deployment of machine learning and the kind of consequences that have. The volume of the data that can be gathered, and also kind of in relation to that, the potential for it. So there's greater potential for it, but also greater risks and harms from misuse. And so that turns what was always a political challenge, set of political challenges or problems, into something that is of greater priority, I think, than has historically been the case. So there's a sort of a historical point there. And then as someone who works at an institute that is interdisciplinary, I think that, you know, we've got philosophers, we've got public engagement experts, historians, technologists. I think that one of the things that we can say with great certainty is that we've seen some of these problems in old guises before, in other sectors, in relation to other questions. And there's a real value in sort of drawing upon the richness of that sort of, you know, intellectual traditions that we can draw upon to try to tackle changing problems rather than new problems.
Mm-hmm. Would you be able to expand a little bit about on the Lovelace Institute's emphasis on mission on reshaping narratives? So does that is that targeted specifically on like drawing on the knowledge of these of the experts in house, or presumably experts outside the house as well, to develop ideas and pitch those ideas to interested parties, or also regulators, or primarily regulators?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, the narrative thing is quite is of importance to us, just because, well, for several reasons when we're thinking about data. One is that there's still just an observation that there's really contested narratives still about data. So you know, we haven't found the right narrative, and actually there's this question whether that's you know, something that we want to do, but what the contestation of a narrative they're kind of weaving and they're rupturing, and the sort of debate that we're having about whether data can be owned or commodified, or is like oil or is like water or whatever, is actually reflecting this kind of wider societal debate that we're having about its role and how we govern it. So any program about system change in the data governance ecosystem, it felt to me would be very amiss if it didn't think about this highly contested conversation that we're having about narrative. The other dimension around narrative is that there's a really interesting body of work by George Lakoff and Johnson and others that show how our language often tells narratives, often without our even realizing it. And so it felt like a really important thing to do, which is to sort of consciously reflect on the way that we talk about data, because it's an abstract concept, and so often the way we talk about data gives us a clue as to and conditions the way we then do data governance practice and regulate data. So it felt there was a really important relationship between narrative practices and regulation. And then there's some other really interesting work which is about the extent to which we are talking about uncertain and indeterministic technological futures. So one of the things that's really unusual or different about technologies is that it is being shaped very, very rapidly, and it shapes our futures or our outcome. And there's a lot of really interesting work, mainly in the economic space. So people like Robert Schiller on economic narrative that is beginning to unpick the role that narratives play in the choices that we make about the future, and the role of technology in the future, but also the role of economics in the future. So here narrative seems to be self-perpetuating particular types of outcomes, which is a really interesting thing. So, you know, that narrative increasingly seems to be about imagining the way the future could be. I mean, a really interesting example is actually science fiction. You know, a lot of science fiction has been written over the years to try and think about what impact technology may have in the future. And actually, when we look at some science fiction, we look at what now possible or feasible, the parallels are quite striking. Yeah, I won't say much more on that, other than sort of say that we've got a lot of research underway and we're really thinking about this. And so yeah, do let me know if you're interested, because we're also looking at convening some stakeholder workshops on this as well.
Yeah. So to what extent would you say that more of the work is on like really big picture narratives? And do you have like more working groups also focused on smaller kind of focused issues?
Yeah. So the specific objective of this program is the big picture. So we felt that gap is there in terms of that sort of taking that systemic lens. But at the Ada Lovelace Institute, we have also got a lot of work on very specific questions or issues. So one area that we're very interested in exploring is this kind of question of the impact of the use of data and AI on the way public bodies operate and public services in particular operate. So to work on the algorithmic state, as it were. We've been doing a lot on COVID-19 technology, so you know, digital contact tracing in particular. I mentioned Exit Through the App Store report. We've also been doing a lot around biometrics technologies, so facial recognition technologies and voice recognition technologies, because they present particular challenges for you know, the self as mediated by technology. So so this really interesting challenge, which is that because of the way in which biometric technologies relate to unique identifiers of the person, that raises especially profound ethical issues. So when it comes to facial recognition technology, both in terms of the impact it has on people, but also the way it may be changing or shaping the way people live their lives or act in a public space, for instance. So, and also this work that we're doing on partnership between private and public bodies, largely public engagement work, seems to be of value. A lot of people seem to find that really interesting and useful.
Okay, so we've got a question here from Piero, and he asks, don't you think that data in general will be a tragedy of the commons, where there will be a race to the bottom for the use and abuse of data? Potentially, companies may have competitive advantages over those who exist within any regulatory framework. Even at a national level, can you see countries like China who potentially monitor their populations to a degree that we may object to in this country, but they can point to better public health outcomes, especially with respect to COVID? There's several questions there. Okay, should we start with the, oh, Pierre's now tell me it's 2 questions. Should we start with the tragedy of the commons question? Is there a race to the bottom for the use and abuse of data?
Yeah, I quite like, you know, I mean, obviously the tragedy of the commons comes from the idea. I mean, I think there's a really interesting thing, which is the extent to which the data, obviously data isn't, you know, more of it on one person's part or organization's part doesn't mean that there's less of it for another person or another organization. So there's a kind of slightly different feature of data, which is its non-rivalrous feature, which makes it harder. I actually think I would probably think about this kind of question, which is about the race to the bottom for the use and the abuse of data. So the real reason for why companies may take an enclosure-based approach to data, essentially, which is what this is about, is that they would they may get a competitive advantage from doing so. That's the kind of the issue, and that is very much in tension with the idea that for it to have public good or public benefit, you know, data in some way needs to be, at least at some level, enabled as being used by public organisations or research organisations for public benefit. And so the point there really is that it isn't that there is a tragedy of the commons, i.e. you don't have a finite resource at risk of being depleted, but you have a system in which, unless you create the right incentives, the default will always be to enclose it rather than to make the best possible use of it. And so when we kind of shift to that lens or that way of thinking about it, things get more interesting and also a bit harder, because then the kind of question about data governance and how you realize that vision is about how do you move away from a situation where companies and industry organizations feel their competitive advantage comes from enclosing data, towards a situation where companies and other organizations, all of whom are really relevant actors in the landscape, feel that there is a collective social benefit in not enclosing data. And yeah, no, it's a great, great question. So the problem isn't the tragedy of the commons, the problem is the enclosure of data when it doesn't need to be enclosed, and the incentives that push the other way. Yes.
And I think we've got time for one more question, so we'll move on to the Piero's second question. So he says, even at a national level, you can see countries like China who potentially monitor their populations to a degree that we may object to in this country, but they can point to better public health outcomes, especially with respect to COVID.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd probably separate 2 things, which is the relationship between surveillance and better public health outcomes. And to me, it's not clear that more surveillance necessarily lends itself to better public health outcomes. So firstly, there's that. it doesn't seem that there is much of an evidence base to suggest that surveillance-based technology will lend themselves to best public health outcome. And then the second point is that even if it did, is that the sort of society or the country in which you would want to live in? And that is surely up for debate, which is, you know, even if there was a tension or a trade-off, would we make that choice? And I'm not sure that we necessarily would. Or we may make a choice on a very temporary basis to do that, as we're doing that, but we would want to see clear boundaries established around those choices and a proper conversation about it. So yeah, and also longer term, the sort of short-term versus long-term risks that come from compromising the deliberative or the democratic features of a state should not be overlooked. So in the short term, you may lend yourself to having better public health outcomes, but I'm not sure there's much of an evidence base to suggest that authoritarian states do a really great job with generating great public health outcomes in the long term. So, but this is not I actually think this isn't just about technology and society. I think it's just more about how we think about the relationship between technology and democracy, which is a huge, huge question, and maybe something that we should dedicate an entire research stream to.
Excellent. Well, that seems like an appropriate way to draw our session to a close. Thank you very much, Reema, for guiding us through this very interesting topic and highlighting the fascinating work that the Institute's doing. And very important.
These are amazing questions. I'm really impressed with the quality of the sort of, you know, interventions and questions. Yeah, it's excellent.
And is there anything else you'd like to say before we wrap up? Anything you'd like to highlight about the Institute's work, or how to get in touch with the Institute or yourself?
No, I mean, you've got the website and we're on Twitter and all of that. So yeah, no, feel very free to reach out if there's anything you think might be relevant. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Reema. Thank you, everybody. See you next time.